Alright, Assalamualaikum and hello everyone. We will begin our group discussion for week 11, focusing on the translation and analysis of the Malay short story Segenggam Tanah Setitik Darah by Wahyu Budiwarendra. So this discussion is intended to reflect our collaborative process rather than a formal presentation. We will examine the narrative context, culture and social background, translation strategies, literary analysis, and finally reflect on how translation choices influence interpretation and reader response. So Mia, would you like to start first?
Yes, thank you, Ellie. Throughout this discussion, we will also reflect on the challenges that we face as translators, and also particularly when dealing with culturally embedded meanings and symbolic language. I will introduce a little bit on the story. So, Senggenggam Tanah Setitis Darah is an allegorical Malay short story that uses mythical creatures, particularly dragons, to criticize human negligence, moral decay, and the lack of unity within community. Through symbolism and fantasy, the story reflects societal failure to heed warnings and take collective responsibility. So, a little overview about the author is that Wahyu Budiwarendra bin A. Wahid is a Malaysian writer born in Johor Bahru in 1978. He has been active since 2002 and writes short stories, poetry, and drama, and is a recipient of major literary awards such as Anugerah Penulis Muda Johor and Hadiah Sastra Darul Takzim.
So I'm gonna start. So to begin with, I think it's important to understand what kind of story Senggam Tanah Sedikit Darah actually is. In my opinion, this isn't a story that we're supposed to read literally. It's very allegorical, and the author W.B. Rendra uses dragon and destruction to talk about human behavior, especially negligence, arrogance, and the failure to work together. What stood out to me is that the villagers themselves raised and protected the dragons at the beginning. So in a way, they help create the very thing that later destroyed them. I also find it interesting that the story doesn't focus on just one hero. Instead, we hear many voices: the king, the commoners, thinkers, warriors, religious figures, all reacting differently. This this shows that the problem isn't one person, but society as a whole. So, with the general context in mind, maybe we can now look at how these ideas influence the way we translated the text. Kiki, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree with Vila on that point. When we were translating, we had to constantly remind ourselves that this is a symbolic story, not a straightforward narrative. So, one of our main concerns was keeping the emotional intensity. For instance, the repeated line in the short story is api, api, api. We translated it as fire, fire, fire. Some people might think that it is too simple, but to be honest, I think that simplicity is what makes it powerful. It sounds urgent, chaotic, and panic, just like in the original Malay. Another part that really stood out to me was I Mata Darah. We kept it as tears of blood, even though it sounds extreme in English. Softening it would actually weaken the message. It's meant to be uncomfortable. And we also decided not to over explain cultural metaphors like thank you butterflies. Instead of explaining it, we trusted the reader to feel the symbolism. So overall, our translation choices really affect how readers understand guilt and regret in the story. Alec, maybe you can talk more about those ideas from a thematic point of view.
Yeah, thanks, Kiki. I think the themes become very clear once you read the translation carefully. One theme that really stood out to me is ingratitude. There is this powerful line where a character asks whether the dragons are ungrateful or if humans are the one who lack gratitude. That question alone shifts all the blame back to the villagers. Another strong theme is disunity. People are constantly blaming each other. The old leaders, followers. Instead of acting together, they argue, and because of that, nothing gets done. The discussion just continues. There's also the theme of ignoring wisdom. The thinkers and elders warned the villagers earlier, but no one listened. By the time they realized the truth, regret doesn't help anymore. I think that's one of the most realistic parts of the story. So the message feels very clear. Disaster don't just happen suddenly. They build up slowly because people refuse to listen or change. So Shaira, how do you do the literary devices help deliver this message?
Yeah, I really love how the literally device makes the theme stronger. The biggest one is allegory. Basically, the whole story represents a society destroying itself through its own flaws. So the dragon, for example, don't just represent monsters. They symbolize power and consequences that human created and then lose control over. Fire symbolizes punishment and destruction while tears of blood represent regret and that comes too late. I also want to mention the Keris Pakaka and Cahaya Purnama. They represent hope and redemption, but what's important is that they only work when combined. That suggests that no single person can fix everything alone, and awareness and unity are necessary. So the imagery is also very vivid. Burning house, smoke, crime villagers. So all of this makes the warning feel very real and emotional. So maybe to wrap things up, Mia can share her thoughts on what this translation experience taught us.
Thank you, Shaira. So, to wrap up this presentation, I think this story really shows how the translation is more than just words from one language to another. We had to think about the culture, symbolism, and how emotions express differently in English. And also, one challenge was deciding when to keep metaphors and when to adjust phrasing so that it still sounded natural. Another challenge was maintaining the collective voices of society while still making individual characters sound distinct. Overall, this translation made me realize that language shapes how we understand blame, responsibility, and also regret. The story reminds us that distraction often comes from denial and not inaction, and also not from sudden events. So I think that is basically what we learn from the translating of this short story. Next, we move on to the collaborative translation process.
So let us now discuss our collaborative translation process, shall we? So the focus is how we work together, challenges we face, and peer feedback, then decision making. Fila, would you like to start first?
Surely. So, for this part, maybe we can talk more casually about how we actually work together during the translation. For me, the first challenge was understanding the text as a group before translating anything. Some parts were quite dense and symbolic, so we had to pause and ask, what is really happening here? Before even thinking about English. I remember we discussed the scene with the dragon at the length because it wasn't just action, it carried moral meaning. If we, if we misunderstood that, the translation would be off. What about you, Kiki? How did you experience the initial translation stage?
Well, yeah, I agree with Villa on that point. I think the group discussion before translating really helped a lot. When I translated my part individually, I realized that some Malay phrases felt very poetic, but sounded awkward when translated directly. So I brought those lines back to the group. For example, phrases like "Rama terima kasih." At first, I wasn't sure whether to explain it or keep it metaphorical. So after discussing it together with all of you guys, we decided to keep it because it fits the allegorical tone. So you can see here, peer feedback was really important. Sometimes someone else would point out that a sentence sounded too literal or too stiff. Ali, I think you gave good feedback on tone. What stood out to you during peer review?
Thanks, Putri. For me, peer review was where the translation really improved. When I read everyone's section, I noticed that some parts sounded very emotional, while others sounded very neutral. So we had to adjust the tone to make it consistent. I remember suggesting changes where emotion like panic or regret could be strengthened, especially in dialogue, for instance. Short sentences and repetition work better than long explanation. Also, sometimes we disagreed, but those disagreements were productive. Discussing why a work choice worked and or didn't work help us understand the stats better. So, Shahira, how did you feel about negotiating meaning as a group?
Honestly, I think negotiating meaning was the hardest but most valuable part. Some symbols like the dragons or the keris pakaka could easily be misunderstood if taken literally. We had to constantly remind ourselves of the allegorical level. I also noticed that the cultural context played a big role. So certain expression make immediate sense in Malay, but need to be careful handling in English. The group discussion really helped to prevent the cultural meanings from being lost. So what I liked the most was that no one worked in isolation. Even after the individual translation, everything went back to the group. So, Mia, how did this collaborative process affects your understanding of the translation?
I think I feel the same. I mean, working collaboratively made me realize that translation isn't a solo task, especially for literary texts. Hearing different interpretations from every group members helped me to see the meanings that I might have missed on my own. And sometimes a line that I thought was clear turned out carry a deeper symbolism after discussion. And the back and forth forced us to justify our choices and not just go with what sounds right. Overall, this process showed us that good translations comes from discussion, compromise, and and shared understanding, not just language skill.
Okay, so through this collaborative process, we didn't just translate a story. We also learned how meaning, culture, and interpretation are negotiated together. So I think that's all from us. Thank you.
Thank you.